So let's start with a little introduction to meditation. A lot of people hear the word meditation and oftentimes they'll think it's like this awkward, cringy, kind of intimate, super hokey, self-help, feels good kind of thing that you do to feel better, right? And while there certainly are some benefits to meditation, some which we'll touch on when we get to the science of meditation, the first thing we have to understand is literally what is meditation, right? Because chances are there have probably been many times in your life where you've been actually pretty frequently meditating for a long time, but you just haven't realized it. And a lot of the weirdness and uncomfortableness around meditation goes away once we understand, from a definition perspective, what is meditation. Meditation was invented by these people called yogis in ancient India, and the language that they spoke at the time was Sanskrit, right? So some of the confusion comes from the fact that there's actually at least 5 Sanskrit words that all get translated to the West as meditation. And these yogis who invented meditation don't actually have one Sanskrit word for meditation, right? So literally the people who invented meditation don't refer to it as one thing because they talk about it from sort of a nuanced understanding. The first translation for meditation is the word dharana. Dharana is Sanskrit for focusing, concentrating, or technique. Dharana is a verb, so it's something you do, and it's an action that you can take, right? So if we think about different kinds of meditation techniques, so for example, I'm listening to a guided meditation, or I'm chanting a particular phrase over and over and over again, or I'm paying attention to the sound of my breath. So all of these are actions that we take. They're methods of focusing our mind. And the goal of doing dharana is by using a particular technique, we essentially use one object to push out all other objects, right? So we use one technique to push out all other thoughts of our head, all other emotions, things like that. And so if we think about the mind, right? The mind can't actually be stopped. It can only be redirected. Right, so if someone's distracted about something, so let's say video games, so I'm thinking about how the new Minecraft update is super disappointing, it's it completely changes the game and all that stuff, or I'm thinking about how the new Dota champion came out, right? So I can actually just snap my hands and say okay mind, stop thinking. All you can literally do is redirect the mind. So, right, so I can't be okay, let me just stop thinking about Valorant so my GPA does not tank. Right, so even though that might make me feel a little bit worried, right, so even though trying to stop my mind makes me feel worried, that'll actually sort of add to the flame, which we'll talk about later, that won't actually work, right? You can't actually just stop the mind. All I can actually literally do is redirect the mind, not stop it. So some of the benefits of regularly practicing dharana are improvements in focus, so things like studying and also motivation and things like that, so essentially the ability to start and follow through with the task. And things like focusing and studying and things like that also are benefits of dharana. So the second word for meditation is dhyana, which translates to no mind state or meditative state. Right? So dhyan is a noun, not a verb, and it isn't actually something that you can do. It's something that happens to you. So the cool thing is that when a human being keeps doing a dharana for some time and gets lucky, irrespective of what dharana they do, then if they get lucky, then they'll end up in dhyan. Now, this concept is really important to know because a lot of the confusion and frustration about meditation comes from a misunderstanding of dharana and dhyan. Because if you listen to someone who's a frequent meditator, they may say things like, yeah, this morning I sort of meditated and I was I had this great experience because it was so peaceful, calming, and I was really content with myself. And, I was in a completely different place and all this stuff, right? That person isn't talking about dharana though. They're actually talking about dhyan. Because that's a state of mind that they entered, right? It's not something that they did. So if I'm a novice meditator, I get super confused. Because if you listen to what they say and then you sit down and meditate, you forcibly try to enter that no-mind state, but it's really disheartening, frustrating, because your mind sort of won't sit still and it keeps jumping around and things like that. So the first thing to understand is that you can never do dhyan, right? So you can't say, okay, right now I'm going to set a timer for 10 minutes, I'm going to do dhyan now. All you can actually do is sit down and do the dharana. You can do the technique. So I can sit there and focus on my breath. And if I'm lucky, so if I focus on my breath for long enough or the stars align, right? So then I'll end up in a state of mind that feels really incredibly calm, which is dhyan. So a good analogy to sort of illustrate this principle of verb versus noun and getting lucky is going to bed versus falling asleep. Because colloquially, we talk about going to bed like it's a verb. Right? I'm going to watch a few videos and then fall asleep. But if you actually pay attention to your experience of sleep, you can actually do sleep. I know it sounds kind of weird, but all you can do is go to bed, right? All you can do is tuck yourself in, and if you get lucky, then over time, you'll end up finding yourself fall asleep, dreaming, or you'll find yourself waking up. So it's a state of consciousness that appears through luck by doing a particular action. And just like going to bed and sleeping, there are particular things you can do to increase your RNG and facilitate entering the state of dhyan. So for some people, it's easy to sleep with the TV on. Some people find that it's easier to sleep when they're sort of like completely quiet, right? So some people find it easiest with a colder room, and other people find, they sort of enjoy the coziness of the warmth, right? So the dharana that works for one person may not particularly be the dharana that works for someone else. And just like figuring out like optimal sleep conditions, consistent entry into dhyan involves finding the right dharana that's best suited for you and your mind and makes it easiest for you to enter dhyana. Another reason people find they're bad at meditating is because they sit down and they do a technique that's not really suited for them, right? And their mind keeps wandering a lot, so they have to kind of force their mind to get it back into the right place, right? And they listen to other people who seem to like just focus on their breath so easily, therefore I am bad at meditating. But if you really think about it, in a weird way, the more your mind wanders, like the more your mind sort of like goes all over the place and starts thinking about stuff when you try to meditate, and the more you bring it back, the better you're actually going to get at meditation in the long run. When I tell my mind to sit in one place and it wanders away, so I force it to come back, and then it wanders away and I force it to come back, that is essentially like doing push-ups. Right? So every time my mind wanders and I bring it back, it wanders, I bring it back, I bring it back, I bring it back. Literally what I'm doing is training my mind to come back to one spot, which is actually the most important skill for meditation. So ironically, the people who think that they're bad at meditation because they struggle so much, right? Their mind keeps sort of like going all over the place. So when they sort of get their mind to sit in one place, they're actually doing the most push-ups and strengthening their mind the most every time they meditate. For people who have it very easy, they don't actually end up training their mind very much, right? Because they're sort of lucky, or not even that they're lucky, like their temperament sort of like makes it easy, right? So their temperament and their mental style may make it easier to do the technique that they're doing. But if you feel like your mind wanders a lot every time you sort of meditate, so every time it wanders and you force it to bring it back, you're actually the one who's gaining XP and leveling up this skill called dharana. And consistent entry into dhyan happens when your mind is very able to like sort of come back to one thing. So all this talk about doing dharana and getting lucky into dhyan is like cool and all, right? But it doesn't really seem very scientific in nature. But it turns out that homeostasis is a concept that perfectly mirrors dharana versus dhyan. So let's say I just came out of the shower and I put on a shirt, right? So the moment I put on the shirt, I may be highly aware of the sort of feeling of the shirt on my chest, right? But over time, that feeling kind of goes away, right? So like over time, I'm not actually like aware of it. I'm not like thinking about it. So like I'm not sort of like thinking about how I'm wearing a shirt anymore. So we have this natural system called homeostasis, which is essentially our body's way of balancing something that's been there for a long period of time. Right, so if I jump into a very cold pool of water, I may feel the chilliness of the water and start to shiver for a while. And even though, I know it sounds kind of weird, but even though literally the temperature didn't change, over time I kind of I just stopped feeling the coldness, right? And that process of acclimatizing to something you've been doing for a long time is called homeostasis. So the cool thing is that just how if you wear a shirt, over time you may not notice the feeling of the shirt as much. If you do dharana for some period of time, over time your mind acclimatizes to the sort of steady stream of focus that you're putting it into, which is essentially the state of dhyan, right? So the benefits of dhyan are a lot of like sort of health benefits that come with meditation. So we'll talk about like neuroscience changes and hormone alterations and things like that, which will go into more detail in the science of meditation. So all of the sort of benefits of dhyan are all stated in the science of meditation. So the ultimate goal of meditation is to attain moksha or enlightenment. And sometimes when you meditate, you'll actually go into something called samadhi, which is the third translation for meditation, but more literally translates to temporary enlightenment. And samadhi is sort of like a substate of dhyan. So we'll start with an action. So I'll sit there and like chant a particular phrase over and over and over again. And if I'm lucky, then I'll go from doing that dharana to entering dhyan, right? And if I spend enough time for dhyan, right? If I spend enough time in dhyan for a while and I get really lucky, then I will enter into another state of consciousness called samadhi. So you can kind of think about like going to bed versus falling asleep versus dreaming, right? Or like going to class versus not paying attention versus daydreaming, right? So like dreaming is like a state of mind that grows out of sleep, which is basically exactly how it is with dhyan and samadhi. So the thing about samadhi is that sometimes when people meditate for really long periods of time, so you'll hear this from like people who've been regular meditators for like weeks, months, or even years, they'll start to actually become different people, right? And they'll think and view the world in like a different way. So some of the more like cosmic changes that people talk about, like being happier from day to day, all come from samadhi. So the next thing to talk about is another practice that people translate as meditation, and that's samyama. So samyama is basically the act of combining dharana, dhyana, and samadhi, right? So samyama is definitely like one of the more complicated forms of meditation, and I'll sort of share a couple of samyama techniques at the end of the video in the 100 techniques portion, but it's really hard to talk about and try to explain to people who haven't experienced it yet. So the closest I can get to like trying to capture the process of samyama is essentially like reading a textbook over and over and over and over and over again. Right, so the yogis will do samyama practices on like certain things, right? So you may hear some people talk about like some of these really like weird sort of like mystical stuff. You'll hear like people talk about how you can get superpowers through meditation, right? Like unlocking past life memories, levitation, knowledge of time and death, super strength, hunger cessation, and all this sort of like weird non-scientific things that like the yogis essentially claimed that work, right? And so all those kind of stuff that they claim works all come from this practice that they called samyama. And so I won't sort of tell you in this video to like believe if samyama is real, if samyama is not real, stuff like that. So I'd actually encourage you to like do samyama practices, and if it doesn't work for you, then it doesn't work, right? And so practicing samyama, so the yogis essentially claim that practicing samyama gives you perfect control over the mind, and furthermore that doing samyama on particular things, like doing samyama on memories, pictures, certain body parts, gives you like essentially perfect knowledge over it, and apparently that's how you sort of cultivate those sort of magical powers. And now we're going to take a slight tangent into mindfulness. In Sanskrit, mindfulness is translated as sakshi bhava, which more literally translates to witnessing attitude. So the witnessing attitude is the first and most basic state of dhyan. So there's actually further levels of dhyan and samadhi, but it's essentially the capacity to separate self from mind, right? So it's that capacity to sort of separate the self from mind and sort of simply observing this difference, right? So most of the time we don't think about ourselves as different from the mind, right? So we think that who we are is what we think, and we don't acknowledge that there's sort of a gap between ourselves and the mind. When we do mindfulness, we essentially increase the gap between self and mind. And it's literally sort of like just sitting there and like observing this difference. So technically, if you really think about it, it's not even really a meditation, right? Mindfulness isn't really meditation, it's an attitude of witnessing. Now, a lot of people believe that mindfulness is the only form of meditation because that's the one they hear about the most, which is absolutely not true, right? There's like tons of different meditative traditions that all have their own kind of techniques, right? They all have their own different types of techniques and stuff like that. And the really sad thing is that sometimes people will do a mindfulness practice because that tends to be the most popular one right now. They'll not really be good at it, and since they believe that mindfulness is the only form of meditation, they walk away thinking, I'm bad at meditation. But remember that picking the right dharana for you is one that's fun, makes it easiest to enter dhyan, and sort of most convenient for you at any given time, right? Or any given circumstance. So I, for example, am actually really bad at mindfulness. I find that I get bored and even frustrated to just notice my thoughts but not indulge in them. Mindfulness could be used as a great preparatory exercise, but it's definitely not a goal, right? It's not the main goal of meditation. It's the first realization that self and mind are like different things. So if you find yourself struggling with mindfulness, maybe that's not the right meditation technique for you. So if the ultimate goal of meditation is enlightenment and samadhi is temporary enlightenment, then what is enlightenment? So the ironic thing is that the original purpose of why the act of meditation was even invented was to attain something called moksha, or enlightenment. And with the explosion of all this mindfulness interest and like apps and blog entries and like guided YouTube meditation videos and things like that, you know, people just sort of stopped talking about enlightenment and like sort of left it behind, right? And the big reason for that is because, you know, enlightenment was originally sort of grounded in some sort of spirituality or religion, right? And the explosion of mindfulness wasn't really interested in spreading faith in like a particular religion. So we're going to try to avoid that trap and steer clear of the religion as best as we can in this video and talk about enlightenment from a more like practical sense. So enlightenment is often described as isness, but that's sort of complicated to understand right now. So a better way to think of it is a state of eternal peace independent from the mind. So the mind still actually has like thoughts and emotions, A couple qualities of enlightenment are sukha, or bliss, Advaita Vedanta, or non-duality, Nirguna, or without quality, and ego dissolution. Sukha, or bliss and contentment, is essentially a state where you're detached from that which you are. Emotions and thoughts are fluctuations of the mind, but enlightenment is on an axis that's perpendicular. So it's peace in spite of sadness and happiness. So you can actually still be happy or sad while being enlightened. So we'll talk a lot about suffering when we touch on the depression chapter of the video, but essentially if you look at where does happiness come from, it comes from a lack of suffering, and suffering comes from attachment or expectations, and expectations comes from the mind not dwelling in the present. So if you do a quick hop, skip, and a jump, one place happiness comes from is the mind living in the present. So even if you kind of reverse engineer this statement and say like, thinking about the past or future is a symptom of expectation, and expectation is a symptom of attachment, and attachment is a symptom of suffering, and suffering is a symptom of not being happy. Therefore, thinking about the past or future leads to not being happy. So the biggest reason people who are enlightened are able to be sort of blissful, contentful, and be filled with sukha all the time is because they've actually trained their mind to constantly live in the present, right? They've trained their mind to focus on what's happening now instead of what's happening months, days, or even hours ago, and also what's gonna happen in years, months, days, or hours from now. So another reason people who are enlightened are happy is because remember that not being happy comes from thinking about the past or future. So one thing you could do is train yourself in the present, right? So sort of live in the present to prevent your mind from thinking about the past and future. But another thing you could do is actually turn off the mind entirely. And this is where meditation comes in. Because meditation does both of these things, right? Meditation is literally the practice of focusing on the present. And when you focus on something long enough and you get lucky, then you'll enter dhyan, which is a no-mind state. So if you focus on the present for long enough, eventually you'll become enlightened, which is sort of the whole concept behind like how meditation works. And it's sort of a two-way street too, because the less you suffer, the more enlightened you are, and the more enlightened you are, the less you suffer. So again, this explanation of contentment versus suffering is kind of all through the lens of enlightenment, but we'll talk more about suffering and more specifically like practical tips on how to tackle suffering in the depression chapter. Now the next feature to talk about is Advaita Vedanta, which translates to non-duality or non-dualism. Now there's, a lot of people will talk about Advaita for years, and monks will sort of attempt to study it for decades on end. So I'm going to give a quick introduction to Advaita. Remember, this is one 18-year-old's limited understanding of what Advaita is and how it works. So when we sort of live life, right, a lot of times in response to when something happens or in response to something happening, we categorize certain things as either good or bad, right, or right or wrong, right? So like I'm going through college, right, and college is good, and having a high-paying job is good. And on the flip side, this food is bad or video games are bad. Now, from a simplicity standpoint, the system of duality is really helpful if we're trying to be efficient and like preventing a certain action, right? So for example, if I'm trying to govern a country or state, instead of individually talking to every single person who does something that hurts or like damages people about why they did that, I could make a law that says hurting people is bad. And whenever someone in my country is hurting people, I can arrest them. Now that's really useful for trying to control and preserve large batches of people where it can become really inefficient to talk to every single person and we want to sort of avoid a certain action from happening. The problem is that subscribing to this dualism standpoint, we miss out on like the sort of nuance and understanding for things we apply to dualism too, right? So a good example of this is like if I'm trying to figure out why do people steal, and there's a rule in place that says stealing is bad. Person A may steal because he really wants the car that someone else has. Person B may steal because her family is starving. Person C may steal because like he feels envious of the people who have a certain brand of watches. Person D may steal because she realized that stealing is sort of like stealing for living is sort of like a high risk, high reward kind of situation where you can like, if you get really good at it and you don't get caught, then you don't actually need to work hard in life and to make a lot of money and stuff like that. And so if we have this idea that stealing is bad, sure, it'll prevent the stealing from happening, but it handicaps my knowledge for why people steal in the first place. Because person A, B, C, and D each have their own reasons for stealing. So each of them have a way forward with specific, like sort of specificity and nuance, right? So Advaita Vedanta says that things are the way they are. And it is our mind which layers this idea of good or bad. And the more we attach ourselves to our mind labeling things as good or bad, the more we suffer. So if you look at like a rock and ask yourself, is this rock a good rock or a bad rock? The real answer is that it's not really a good rock or a bad rock, right? There's not just a thing as a good rock or a bad rock. It's simply a rock. Now, our mind can call it a good rock or bad rock by comparing it to another rock or adding an expectation to the rock. But if you look at, and we'll talk more about this whole concept of like calling things as they are versus not as they are when we talk about ego and stuff, but at its truest form, the rock isn't good or bad. It's just a rock. So in enlightenment, the gap between good and bad starts to shrink. And people who are enlightened start to not put labels on things as good and bad or right and wrong, and therefore are able to truly see and appreciate and understand something for what it is, rather than being caught up in whether it's sort of good or bad. So now we're going to talk about Nirguna, right, which is sort of an extension of Advaita. Nirguna is Sanskrit for no qualities, and this one's hard for even me to understand, so I'll try to explain it the best I can. But at the end of the day, it's not that big of a deal if you don't get it, because not just this chapter, but almost everything in this video is based off of a perspective of experience and not logical reasoning. So once you enter a state of temporary enlightenment, then you'll know exactly what the yogis were talking about when they described like Advaita and Nirguna and like ego dissolution and all these things like that. But the general gist of it is that, if you think about how we relate to things, we add certain qualities to them, right? So like this apple is red, that chili pepper is hot, or even things like I am fat. So all of these qualities that we give to things like tall, strong, useless, harmful, colorful, etc. are all going to be drastically different and variable depending on what we look at. But if you really pay attention, it's not really you that's adding those descriptions or qualities to things, right? It's your mind. So Nirguna says that nothing in this universe truly has qualities to it, or at least nothing can truly be categorized by having certain qualities, like red, short, soft, or bitter. And everything just is, which comes back to enlightenment is described as isness, right? That I sort of mentioned at the beginning of this chapter. Now, this may sound like a real stretch, but remember that the mind is kind of like an organ, just like your heart, brain, stomach, or liver, and one of its functions is to add qualities like hard or soft to it, like to certain objects and stuff. And not only are you not your mind, but the mind can also be turned on and off through meditation. So if you are not your mind, and the mind can add qualities and descriptions and categorize things, and it can be turned off, then that must mean that things like qualities, descriptions, and identifications cannot truly capture what something is, which is how the yogis came to the conclusion of Nirguna, or that nothing has qualities. Now, there's many features of enlightenment that I didn't mention in this video, but the last one we'll talk about in this chapter is ego dissolution. Now, there's a whole section on the chapter on mind dedicated to ego, so we're just going to go through ego dissolution through the lens of enlightenment, right? So, like, a big part of suffering has to do with our identity, or more importantly, like, how attached we are to our sense of self, right? So we'll say things like, I am a student, or I am tall, but before I was a student, I was still me. Right? Before I was tall, I was still me. So there's a part of me that's always sort of like there, and that's been like treading throughout my life, arguably even before my life and after my death, which that is sort of like what I truly am. Right? So people who are enlightened are able to sort of realize that who they truly are, and who they truly are isn't sort of like these identifications, right? And once they realize who they truly are, life sort of becomes like a movie, where they're simply watching a movie and are super detached, right? They're like this observer. And their ego is not at all important to them, since, for them it's fundamentally false. And this transitions into another sort of quality of enlightenment, which is laughter. So enlightened people tend to laugh at everything, and the reason is probably because life becomes a movie where they can sort of take a step back and nothing causes them suffering.